it's not going to change. Not going to change the empirical results too much. Finally, one thing to note is that the household surveys that we use do vary quite a lot in terms of their aggregate recording of consumption relative to national accounts, and that's going to be important, at least for thinking about the cash values in terms of benefits that households receive from preferential VAT rates that I'll show later. Okay, so moving on to the method. I'm not going to say loads on the overall microsimulation models that we use, because I think a lot of the features of the models that we use are quite standard. So our analysis uses tax benefit microsimulation models built by, two of them are built by us at the IFS, which is the Tax Dev Center at the IFS, and the other four are joint collaborations between members of the Commitment to Equity Institute and the World Bank. So we've harmonized our key features of each of these models to ensure that our results are as comparable as possible. All of these models are static, so there's no behavioral response that's going to be incorporated in our results here, which means that real quantities of consumption and production are going to be held fixed in all of our results. This means that any effects that we show from reform scenarios can be interpreted as first order welfare approximations of the true welfare effect of such reforms. Otherwise, you can think of it as an upper bound for a tax increase or a lower bound for a tax decrease. In terms of how we measure real income, or our measure of household welfare, we're going to measure that as consumption per capita. So that's excluding durable purchases, but including the user values for durable goods, and including home produced and bartered goods, and netting off indirect taxes and subsidies. This is in line with the idea of, or the concept of consumable income in a CEQ assessment. So with these relatively standard microsimulation models, we're going to study baseline tax and benefit systems and reform scenarios. Cash transfers, where we look at cash transfers in these models, where possible, we are going to simulate cash transfer receipts based on eligibility criteria that we see in the surveys. The reason we do this where possible is that overall the surveys tend to under-record cash transfer receipts when they're observed. So we, as I say, we simulate them in 4 countries where we have the requisite information. In 2 countries, the surveys don't provide enough information to simulate these receipts, so we just take the survey responses in terms of observed cash transfer income in the other 2. Of course, neither approach here is perfect. A simulating approach is going to give a nice view of kind of targeting in principle, but it does impose that inclusion and exclusion errors are 0, and that there's full take-up of these benefits, which are clearly strong assumptions. At the same time, observed values are subject to often under-reporting. In some cases can be over-reporting, but in our cases tends to be under-reporting, and subject to response biases as well. So neither approach is perfect, but I think using a combination of the 2 is going to give a useful picture of patterns across a range of countries. That's all I'm going to say on the overall look of the models and how we look at cash transfers, because that's quite simple. I'm going to spend a bit more time now talking about how we model VAT exemptions. Now, the VAT exemptions in particular are a common feature of the countries that we're studying, rather than just reduced rates or 0 rates. As a result, we want to incorporate the fact that they cause a break in the VAT chain. A lot of applied work does treat exemptions as 0 rated, and this gives a useful first look at the impact of such policies. But as I mentioned before, an exemption means that VAT on intermediate transactions is not reclaimable, and thus can become embedded in supply chains. So VAT exemptions can mean that the final VAT rate, or the accumulated VAT on consumer purchases, can be higher than the statutory rate. Increasingly, input-output tables are used to incorporate how indirect taxes that are levied on producers feed through into final consumer prices. So David Cody at the IMF has done lots of work on this, and his team. So there's some useful resources out there for an introduction to these methods. And these are particularly important, for instance, with fuel taxes, for instance, where a lot of fuel taxes are levied on producers and then eventually are likely to feed through into consumer prices. But we're focusing on VAT exemptions here, and the fact that these can cause an embedded tax to fall on producers, which can get passed on. And we build on existing work by making a couple of small adjustments. Firstly, we distinguish between domestic inputs into production and imported inputs into production. The reason we do this is that imported inputs, if we abstract from global value chains, so the fact that something can go out of the country and then back in again, abstracting from that, imported inputs should not include any embedded domestic VAT. So this embedded effect of exemptions causing VAT to accumulate in the supply chain should not occur for imported inputs. That's why we distinguish these two. In the paper, we also set out a method that could in principle allow for different VAT rates for formal and informal producers, and that could allow for differential market segmentation between formal and informal producers. This would allow a much more detailed picture of, in principle, of tax rates across different producers and consumers. As we'll come on to, we don't have the data to actually implement this method, but hopefully in some context in the future, it might be able to be done. So how do we go about modeling VAT exemptions then to incorporate these effects? So this is the first formula that we write down to estimate the total VAT accumulated on each sector's domestic outputs in the economy. So to go through this a bit more slowly, what we're setting out here is that in a perfectly functioning VAT system, that means with perfect refunds and with no non-compliance on VAT, and under an assumption of full cost push, that means any taxes levied on producers getting passed through to final consumer prices, we can write out the vector of total VAT paid on each domestic sector as the following. So the product of the vector of effective VAT rates T and the matrix of domestic outputs X. Walking through this full formula will hopefully make clear that it's not maybe as complicated as it potentially first looks. So the total vector of VAT paid is the sum of the statutory VAT, that's the vector T, paid on each sector's outputs, plus the effective, so T is the effective vector, effective VAT rate vector, which is paid on gamma D is the matrix of different inputs from each sector used by each sector. It's the matrix of technical coefficients of inputs for each sector. So what this gamma D matrix has is the cost share of each product in the economy, which is made up of each other product in the economy. So each sector pays effective VAT rate on its inputs, domestic inputs, and then this term is allowing for the reclaim of the statutory VAT on a sector's inputs if that sector is not exempt. So this vector E kind of turns on this reclaim function. And then gamma F is the matrix of imported inputs. And on imported inputs, producers only pay the statutory VAT rate because there's no embedded VAT on those imported inputs. And again, if they're not exempt, they can reclaim that statutory VAT paid on their foreign inputs. So that's what we write down initially to characterize the total VAT accumulated on each sector's domestic outputs. Now, if we solve that, if we rearrange this, normalize prices to 1 and solve for T, so that's the vector of effective VAT rates, we get the following equation. What this says is that the effective VAT rate on domestically produced commodities is going to depend on a range of factors. Firstly, on sectoral value added. That makes intuitive sense. It's a value added tax. It's going to depend on the statutory VAT rate charged on that commodity. Again, very intuitive. If the sector is exempt, it's going to depend on the statutory VAT it pays on its inputs. Again, very intuitive. And then finally, the last thing that's important is it depends on the intensity of a sector's use of domestically produced inputs. What this is what's coming in this last term here. Essentially, what this last term here is saying that if a sector uses lots of domestically produced inputs in its production, this is going to allow more chains of production for VAT to become embedded if there is some VAT exemptions causing embedded VAT. So these are just some of the factors which are going to, sorry, this is not very formal, but these are some of the factors which are going to drive differences in effective VAT rates across sectors here. Of course, we are making some assumptions here on the production side. The idea is here that we can change these vectors of statutory VAT rates and exemption status to calculate new vectors of effective VAT rates that we'll use in our model. Doing so does, of course, impose some assumptions on the production side, and specifically, we're assuming Leontief production technologies, so that inputs are used in fixed proportions. So regardless of how tax rates change or exemption status changes, each sector still uses the same production technology, throughout. So it's a similar kind of type of assumption to that of holding consumption quantities fixed for households. Now, when it comes to actually implementing this model that we've set out for effective VAT rates, unfortunately, data constraints mean we do have to make some additional assumptions. So the first one is that we don't, in any of these countries, actually have a separate matrices of the use of imported versus domestic varieties of a given commodity in the production process. As a result, we have to make a simplifying assumption that for a given, that all sectors use both the imported and domestic varieties of a given commodity in the same proportions that they are supplied or consumed nationally. This allows us to separate the overall matrix of inputs for each sector into a domestic and a foreign domestic and foreign sourced inputs. The second two assumptions are perhaps a bit stronger and highly relevant for many low middle income countries. So the second one is that we unfortunately don't have good data to allow for different rates of VAT compliance on different sectors. This means we have to assume that all sectors have the same degree of VAT compliance. And related to that, we don't really have good data to allow for different rates of VAT compliance at the household level either. So we generally have to assume that on any given commodity, households pay the same effective VAT rate. What this means is that when we're looking at the impact of VAT systems and reforming those VAT systems, we're really getting a sense of the kind of de jure targeting of those systems, and might be missing some of the effective informality in practice. This is obviously an important consideration for the type of context we're looking at, and so we do spend some time to kind of test the sensitivity of our results to these assumptions 2 and 3 in the context of Senegal, where we do have some better data to allow us to kind of vary those assumptions a bit. Specifically, in Senegal, we have place of purchase data at the household and sector level, which allows us to proxy for informality on consumer purchases. So for instance, if a household buys from a supermarket, we can kind of confidently assume that VAT is paid there as opposed to a street stall. Using this kind of data allows us to vary assumptions 2 and 3 across the consumption distribution and across products, and see how our results change. So I will show that robustness check towards the end, but our main results are going to have those assumptions 1, 2, and 3 in place. I'll speed up through the modeling approach now, but essentially, given those assumptions, we have to adjust the model I've just set out by introducing just an aggregate level of informality or a share of small and tax evading firms. This is going to scale down the tax rates paid, the statutory tax rates paid on each sector, and also the amount that they can reclaim. That's why it comes in here on the statutory tax rates and also on the reclaimability of tax rates on inputs. And we're going to calibrate this alpha based on matching total VAT that we estimate in the models with that in national accounts. In doing so, we assume that there's full VAT compliance on imports. This might be a slight deviation from reality, but we think it's a fairly reasonable assumption because there's no de facto exemptions for imports. Everybody that imports has to pay VAT at the border, and in general, compliance at customs is much higher than on domestic transactions. Introducing that slight adjustment gives us this final effective VAT rate calculation that we're going to use for domestically produced goods in each country. As a result, the effective VAT rate on domestically produced products for each sector is going to be increasing in the statutory VAT rate. It's going to be decreasing in this level of informality that we estimate. The source of inputs, whether they're domestic or foreign, has an ambiguous effect because on the one hand, domestic inputs can have embedded VAT from earliest chains of production. Foreign inputs can't have that embedded VAT, but they are subject to full VAT compliance. So that's all focused on the calculation of effective VAT rates on domestically produced goods. We also need to account for the fact that some consumer purchases are of imported goods, goods that aren't produced by the production technology that we just set out in the previous slides. So to account for this, we take a weighted average of the statutory VAT rate and the domestic effective VAT rate for each sector, and this is given by the vector tau. So tau is going to be the final vector of total VAT rates across each sector. Okay, moving now to the results. So our results focus on simulations of 3 different policies and reforms in each country. So first we look at the existing tax expenditures from preferential VAT rates in each country. We look at the effects across the consumption distribution, how these contribute to poverty measures and inequality, and within decile heterogeneity in these effects. And then we move on to other possible means of redistributing resources and reducing poverty, starting with those existing cash transfer programs in the countries of study, and then moving on to this hypothetical reform where we broaden the VAT base and introduce a universal cash transfer. So starting with the first one, the existing preferential VAT rates. To be a bit more specific about what we do here, we consider the impact of broadening the VAT base and moving almost all goods and services onto the standard VAT rate in each country. So getting rid of exemptions, putting on the standard VAT rate. If there are any cases of a lower VAT rate or a 0 rate on domestic sales, we also move them up to the standard rate, except for a few small exclusions. So specifically things like small firms, financial services, and some of those public services. We exclude those because those are typically in place for administrative reasons, and it's quite clear that that's the case across all of the countries that we look at. Except for those, though, we take a broad brush approach and but we consider the distributional impact of widening the VAT base on all other goods and services. Now, overall, what we find is a pretty mixed picture with regards to the progressivity of these preferential VAT rates. I'll go on to some more specific results in a second, but this is just a quick summary. In some countries, they are mildly progressive. In some others, they are mildly regressive, some fairly neutral across the distribution. But what is common is that in absolute terms, richer households benefit the most. So in cash terms, the benefit from these preferential VAT rates is really concentrated at the top of the consumption distribution. There is also a great deal of variation across the countries that we study in terms of the estimated scale and therefore the estimated kind of revenue potential from a broader VAT base. Overall, though, we find that even though in isolation, preferential VAT rates can be poverty reducing and sometimes potentially by a large amount, they are an expensive way of reaching poor households. So just to provide a bit more detail and show these results a bit more, I don't have time to go through every single country, but I'm just going to pick out a couple which highlight some different patterns. So starting with Sri Lanka, these green bars show the estimated tax expenditure as a percentage of consumption for each consumption decile. So these are 10 groups of households, 10 population deciles ranked by consumption per capita. And we find that in Sri Lanka, these preferential VAT rates are actually quite progressive. So their benefit is close to 4% of consumption for the for households in the bottom few deciles of the distribution, and towards the top, this falls below 2% of consumption. So clearly quite progressive in Sri Lanka. However, if we look at the cash benefit per capita from these preferential VAT rates, it's clearly much higher at the top than for the poorest households. So somewhere around $210 per capita in the richest 10%, and more like 50, 45 at the bottom of the distribution. The same results for Ethiopia show a much smaller scale. So Ethiopia has a broader VAT base, so the revenue potential and the tax expenditure implied by existing preferential VAT rates is much smaller in scale than in Sri Lanka. We actually see the reverse pattern though, where as percentage of consumption, these are actually slightly regressive. So they're slightly tilted towards goods and services that are disproportionately consumed by the richer households. And this means that the cash benefit is really largely captured at the top of the distribution, the poorest households almost receiving, or in absolute terms, a tiny amount of benefit from these policies. As I indicated a couple of slides ago, though, even if it is the richer households that are benefiting the most in cash terms, we do need to recognize that, at least in isolation, these policies do look like they contribute to poverty reduction. So if we were to broaden the VAT base without any kind of compensation, the change in poverty rates would almost be the inverse of these numbers. So it'd be additions to baseline poverty rates. And some of these effects are quite large. So in Senegal, in particular, close to a 3 percentage point reduction in the poverty headcount ratio at the lowest poverty line achieved from these preferential VAT rates. And in all countries, clearly there's a reduction in poverty from these policies if considered in isolation. Of course, this doesn't mean that there's not more effective ways to reduce poverty with the same revenue foregone. And this tax revenue foregone is significant. I stress that these are probably upper bounds given the style of models that we've used, but nonetheless, these numbers are quite significant. So particularly in, if we look at Sri Lanka, there's potential to increase VAT revenues by close to 50%. And in 3 countries, the potential tax revenue gain is above 10% of baseline tax revenues. So these are quite significant potential sums of tax revenue foregone. And for countries where, some of these countries where the need for more tax revenue, domestic revenue mobilization is very strong at the moment. So we've shown from that analysis of existing preferential VAT rates that they're large, they're not that well targeted towards poorer households. What other policies might governments in low and middle income countries be able to consider? As suggested before, policy options tend to be more limited in these contexts, but many countries do now have cash transfer schemes targeted towards poorer households, and that's what we consider next. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, we find that these are much more progressive than deviations in the VAT structure. This holds regardless of whether we use the simulated or the observed values. In almost every case, poor households benefit the most, at least in proportional terms. Crucially, though, we find that coverage, as suggested previously, and often the overall scale of these tends to be relatively limited, especially in comparison to how widespread preferential VAT rates are, again, reflecting varied eligibility criteria and potentially issues of targeting and take-up as well. So if we take a look at Ethiopia here, focusing on the Psmp program in Ethiopia, we see that this is very strongly progressive, with the proportional gains from this program much larger at the bottom of the distribution than in any other decile. Similarly, for Sri Lanka, it's a much bigger program in Sri Lanka, so more households are benefiting from the CHILMOD program in Sri Lanka. But again, the proportional and also the cash benefits in Sri Lanka are much larger at the bottom of the distribution than towards the top. The issue, though, is that so while these are much better targeted, the issue, though, is that the coverage is very incomplete typically. So this graph is showing the percentage of the population in each consumption decile which receives some benefit from the main cash transfer program that we're modeling. And we can see that only in a couple of countries does this go above 40% in the poorest 10% of the population. And in 4 countries that we look at, it's down towards 20 or 10%. And by the time we get to the 3rd or 4th deciles, we're below 20% or below 30% in the highest countries. And these can be households still that are really quite poor. So the coverage of these existing cash transfer programs really seems to be lacking if we're thinking about compensating for something as broad as a wider VAT base. And that motivates the final step of our analysis, which is to consider what scale of redistribution is possible if governments were to broaden their VAT base and expand social safety nets, considering the simplest possible hypothetical policy. So just a revenue neutral universal transfer per capita funded by the revenue gain from a broader VAT base. I'll stress that this is largely for benchmarking in terms of the simplicity of this policy, because we can make nice and easy international comparisons and show how the potential effects vary across different contexts. But it's probably also worth noting that this kind of policy does have some desirable features as well. You can think of, for instance, potentially broader political support for something that everybody receives, no complicated targeting is needed, so on and so forth. And these kind of policies have been gaining more attention and have been rolled out in some contexts, with Iran being the most prominent real-life example. So this graph is going to show the potential revenue gain from this policy, so broadening the VAT base in each country and introducing a universal transfer. And it's just showing the average gain as a percentage of consumption across the consumption distribution. So if we look first at Ghana, we can see that there's really quite significant potential for redistribution from this kind of policy. The poorest households seeing a 10% increase in their consumption, the richest more like a 1.5% decrease in the value of their consumption, and the bottom 7 deciles of the population benefiting on average. In Ethiopia, we see a fairly similar pattern, just smaller scale in terms of the overall scale of redistribution, given the wider VAT base that Ethiopia has at the outset, and also lower levels of inequality. In Zambia, again, a very similar kind of pattern in terms of where the bars go from positive to negative, but really huge potential redistribution in Zambia, mostly reflecting that Zambia is extremely unequal at baseline. And overall, we get a very similar qualitative pattern in each country. It's just the magnitudes that shift according to the factors that I'll come on to in a second. And interestingly, it seems to be around decile 7 where things seem to flip from from winners on average to losers on average. So the main conclusion is that even an untargeted cash transfer would benefit poor households more than preferential VAT rates on average, with the scale of redistribution theoretically possible depending on three key factors. Firstly, the overall cost of existing preferential VAT rates. This determines the size of the universal transfer that we model. Secondly, the relative progressivity of existing preferential VAT rates, which determines the relative loss from expanding the VAT base. And thirdly, overall inequality in each country. This determines the relative gain from introducing the universal transfer compared to baseline consumption in each decile. So while we've modeled here a very simple revenue neutral policy, I think it's also worth noting that there is potential for net revenue gains if more targeted benefits could be used, or if a smaller universal transfer was used. So for instance, fully compensating the bottom three deciles on average would require only using 44% of the revenue gain for a universal transfer in Ghana and 22% in Zambia. And this is a graph showing the share of estimated net beneficiaries from this policy across the distribution in each country. You can see that in the poorest deciles, almost every household would be better off from this policy. And that's actually the case through most of the top 5, 6 deciles. So that wraps up our main results. If I've got a couple of minutes, I will just quickly mention something on our robustness, because I think this was it is quite a strong assumption, and people always ask questions about informality in our results. So we assumed constant informality in our main results. One might expect that in reality, poorer households are more likely to purchase informally. This would actually make preferential VAT rates even less progressive, because in this case, broadening the VAT base would have even less of an impact on poorer households than richer households. You might also expect, though, that exempt sectors are those particularly likely to have many small and informal firms. This would imply that the revenue gain would be smaller from broadening the VAT base, meaning the scale of redistribution possible would also be reduced. We can test the sensitivity of our results to these factors in Senegal, where we have, as I mentioned, place of purchase data, which can proxy for whether consumer purchases are informal and untaxed or not. And so what we're going to do in this robustness check is assume that formal purchases, for instance, from a supermarket, charge VAT to consumers, whereas informal purchases do not. But we do allow informal purchases to still have embedded VAT from the supply chain. So very quickly, these are our main results for Senegal in terms of the impact of existing preferential VAT rates. These bars then show our adjusted results after incorporating informality. I think the interesting thing here is that the ratio of these two bars is actually almost the same across the consumption distribution. So these incorporating informality does not change in Senegal, at least, the relative progressivity of these preferential VAT rates. This largely reflects the fact that actually informality is just high across most of the consumption distribution in Senegal, and thus there's not that much scope for informality to change our results here. Clearly, though, these orange bars are lower than the main results, suggesting that there's lower revenue potential from a broader VAT base, and that's in line with our second point here in the previous slide. What this means is that when we model the broader VAT base and universal transfer, although the qualitative pattern is almost identical, it's just the scale of redistribution that is potentially altered. So poor households benefiting see a kind of 8 or 9% gain in consumption rather than close to 12%. So I'll just wrap up now with summary points. So ultimately, we conclude that preferential VAT rates are not a good way of redistributing resources, mostly because rich households just capture most of the benefits, which means these are an expensive way of achieving a given level of poverty reduction. While existing cash transfers would reduce poverty more cost effectively, their incomplete coverage would mean they would have gaps, and so some households would be made worse off if we just relied on existing programs to compensate for a broader VAT base. But even recycling revenues from a broader VAT base in untargeted ways has the potential to significantly reduce poverty and inequality if effectively implemented. Now, that is of effective implementation is a big question in itself, and we don't say much about that in our research, but we say that in principle, there is potential for lots of redistribution by these kind of policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ross, for your presentation. It's very interesting indeed. There is a comment here in the chat, which I will read for you, from Andres Gomelo. He says, there is an additional cost to the V80 exemptions. It promotes inefficient vertical integration in the production process of those sectors with exempt final products, which also increases the price of those goods. There is a very difficult to consider in the analysis, but from a conceptual point of view, it should be noted, he says. And I don't know if you have thought about that, or you have I don't know, in the case of those countries especially.
Yeah, definitely. We in the paper itself, we discuss this as one of the main kind of concerns with V80 exemptions, certainly, and there is some evidence from I think from Brazil and in South America, looking at the impact of this on distorting supply chains. So yeah, it's definitely a big concern. It doesn't really feature in our actual empirical analysis, which is focused kind of squarely on the distributional and poverty implications of these policies, but it's alongside this equity consideration, that is the efficiency consideration is crucial as well.
Thank you for that. Karina has a question.
Yeah, I suppose a more general question really, Ross. So when we think of V80 exemptions, like redistribution is certainly one of the policy targets of this, but certainly not the only one. And I would consider redistribution to be less a policy target of indirect taxes than, let's say, of direct taxes and welfare. So I suppose abolishing the V80 exemptions, as you've shown here, and then redistributing via UBI or whatever it is, it has a larger effect on poverty, but does it also cancel out some of the other, like, let's say, behavioral targets that were in mind when these kind of exemptions were first put in place? I don't know if you kind of touch on that at all in the paper, but you might say something about that.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I mean, I think one important point here is that I think in the context that we're studying, there's not typically the same kind of suite of targeting policies for achieving redistribution. So these VAT expenditures are some of the most prominent ways of trying to target distributional policies. So I think they are, I mean, from an equity or distributional perspective, they are quite prominent in the countries that we're studying. We do in the paper we discuss what you mentioned there about the existing VAT policy reduced rates or exemptions could have a behavioral motivations as well to promote certain goods on the basis of externalities, for instance. But we also discussed that VAT is not actually a very good tax for achieving those kind of objectives because of its design in terms of allowing for reclaimability on inputs, which means that using the VAT system to address externalities only reaches consumers and doesn't incentivize firms in the same way. So we have some discussion of that, but again, it's not formally incorporated in our analysis in any way. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ross. Javier also has a question or comment.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ross. I think it's a very nice exercise to show, the potential redistributive effect of reforms, both, indirect taxes and direct transfers. I was wondering whether you discuss in your paper the political feasibility of reforming indirect taxes. I mean, from the experiences in Latin American countries, reforms to indirect taxes and indirect subsidies usually create a lot of social unrest.
Yeah.
So I think it's something very important to consider together with the potential redistributive effect of these tools. And related to this, you mentioned tax expenditures, as you know, related to VAT as one of the motivations for this exercise. But I was wondering whether in the context of these countries, there's other tax expenditures that play even, a bigger role, like corporate tax, which this is huge in terms of tax expenditures in Latin America, and whether then a more holistic approach should be considered if we are thinking about strengthening social protection.
Thanks very much, Xavier. Yeah, I mean, the political economy side of things is very difficult, and certainly not unique to any specific type of country around the world. I mean, the UK still has lots of reduced rates of VAT, despite, in answer to Andres's question in the chat, yes, there's lots of research in the UK that's shown that these are not an effective way of redistributing resources or reaching poor households. We could do so much more effectively using our benefit system. So yes, the political economy side of things is not something that we can speak very well to with our research, I don't think. I suppose I see our research as a starting point for maybe moving towards these conversations. Without this evidence base, it's hard to enter those kind of conversations. But there are maybe some lessons from existing examples of policy. So, for instance, in Iran, it's not exactly the same context, but in Iran, what they did was remove or reduce substantially fuel subsidies. So again, a kind of similar policy idea, and set up bank accounts at the same time to compensate households for those fuel subsidies. And so that kind of very salient policy reform in parallel with any changes to indirect taxes, and having a very clear kind of public information campaign which links together the compensating policy with indirect tax rates, that would seem to me to be an important part of any kind of policy package. Not coming from someone who's a political science or political economy expert, though, so that's just my 2 cents. On the other tax expenditures, yes, definitely agree with you that other tax expenditures in some contexts, as you say, corporate tax could be even bigger, and even bigger revenue leakage. And I think that is a broad problem in lots of countries around the world, where often these are not well targeted, they're not actually well documented, so who's actually benefiting from them, and the process for giving them out is not particularly transparent, and they're not well evaluated either, so there's often not evidence as to whether they're achieving their objectives. So fully agree that in lots of contexts, corporate tax exemptions require attention, and other types of tax exemptions, they're just maybe a bit harder to actually measure than what we can do with household survey data, for instance, on the VAT side.
Thank you, Ross. Another question we have here is, well, it is very interesting to see that you can, for example, in this discussion about the green taxes now, you can, because many of them of the fossil fuels consumption are exempt in some countries. So these results would apply for example, a country like UK or Chile, in the sense that you may say that if you finish the exemption and at the same time put like a cash transfer targeted to the people, it may be better than in terms of redistributed terms than to continue with exemption?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a strong argument for that. I think on something like fossil fuels or energy consumption, I think you find quite different patterns across countries of different income levels. So we actually are doing some work on this at the IFS in Ethiopia and Ghana at the moment, where we do quite a lot of work. And what you find in those, if you, for instance, consider something akin to a carbon tax, what you find is in those countries, that would actually be very progressive, even in proportional terms, because in countries like Ghana and Ethiopia, the poorest households are really not, I mean, they don't own vehicles, sometimes they don't even yet have access to modern fuels and things. So in those contexts, a carbon tax or a tax on fossil fuels is going to be strongly progressive. As you move kind of up the development, as you go kind of up income levels, and say you reach somewhere like the UK, that pattern is actually reversed. So in the UK, in proportional terms, a tax on fossil fuels does hit poorer households more. And that definitely creates a kind of political economy challenge. But you would still end up with the same argument where richer households, even if they would be hit proportionately less, would kind of be hit the most in cash terms. And that revenue, as you say, that could be targeted to compensating poorer households. In theory, that would seem to be a policy that could both improve environmental outcomes and reduce inequality. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of merit in that kind of policy.
Well, we are on time now. We thank you again for the presentation, and it was very interesting. And we have a 5 minutes break now, and we will come back with the presentation of Xavier. So we will meet in 5 minutes, okay? Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
We just stopped the video and the mic. I will repeat this recording. I will repeat briefly that Xavier Jara is a research fellow at the Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Essex. He holds a PhD in economics from the Catholic University of Louvain, Belgium. And he is going to present this very recent paper assessing the cushioning effect of tax benefit policies in the Andean region during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, Javier, for being here. We have 55 minutes for your presentation, including questions.
Thank you very much, Claudia, and thank you everyone for the invitation. I'll start sharing my screen. Okay, let me know if you are able to see my presentation.
Yes.
Great. Thank you again. As Claudia mentioned, this is a very recent work we have done in collaboration with several institutions in Latin America. So we have, as part of our partners, the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Ecuador, Universidad Externado de Colombia, and Universidad Pacífico from Peru. And as part of the Essex team, it's myself and also Diego Collado, who is also part of the CHILMOD team. We also benefited from Claudia's input during our meetings, and as I will mention at the end of the presentation, we have some plans to extend this work to other countries, and Chile is one of them. So the aim of this work is to assess the role that taxes and benefits played during the pandemic in mitigating the impact of the drop in earnings as part of the crisis. And we do this for 3 countries, Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru. And we do this at 2 points during the pandemic in 2020. First, we look at the period during 2020 where the economies were hit the hardest by lockdown measures and by the pandemic in general. And then we look at the end of 2020 to assess to which extent the 3 economies recovered. So this is the plan of the presentation. I will be very brief with the introduction. I'll take more time explaining the data and tax benefit simulations. I'll move to the empirical results to then conclude and give you some idea of our future steps. So just a very short introduction. There is still a very limited evidence on the distributional effects of taxes and benefits during the pandemic in Latin America. So the majority of studies related to this topic have focused only on the effect of expanded social assistance programs. So the emergency policies that were introduced by governments to mitigate the distributional impact of COVID. And they have not looked at the role of existing policies, be it benefits or taxes. And the results from this strand of research have largely found that as a result of the pandemic, there is a large increase in income poverty and inequality in the countries of the region that are under study. And in general, there's a limited effect of expanded social assistance programs, except in very few countries like Brazil and Argentina. So our contribution with this work is that we extend this line of research by accounting for the role of both taxes and benefits as a whole. So the role of existing policies before the pandemic and the role of the newly introduced reforms. To do this, we take advantage of household survey data and tax benefit models that have been developed for these three countries. More precisely, what we do is to start from representative household survey data covering the pre-pandemic period. So we take the last quarter of 2019 as our reference period for the pre-pandemic scenario. And then based on this data and data collected during the pandemic, during 2020, mostly on the changes in labor market, we use nowcasting to project the distribution of earnings, the changes in the distribution of earnings, and to create a pseudo microdata that is based on the pre-COVID data, but that we adjust so that it reflects the characteristics of the labor market and earnings during 2020. More precisely at 2 points of 2020, the second quarter and the last quarter of 2020. And then once we have created this pseudo microdata, we use microsimulation models to simulate taxes and benefits and then household disposable income before and during the pandemic. So here you have a small table listing the survey data that we use. These are all large household survey data for the three countries. For Colombia, we use la Gran Encuesta Integrada de Hogares. For Ecuador, Encuesta Nacional de Empleo, Desempleo y Subempleo. And for Peru, Encuesta Nacional de Hogares. As you can see in the period of data collection, we always take the end of 2019 as our reference point. And then we take information from this same surveys about the changes in the labor markets during the pandemic and at the end of 2020. All these three countries have tax and benefit microsimulation models developed in the Euromod software as CHILMOD. And the advantage of using the Euromod platform is that it allows to get a larger degree of comparability in the results when we do cross-country analysis. So this is our starting point. Here in figure 1, what you observe is the share of earners, so the share of people who receive earnings relative to the working age population in each country. And as you can see, in December 2019, for all countries, the share of earners relative to the working age population is above 50%. And as we move into the pandemic, especially the second quarter of the pandemic, we see a large decrease in the share of earners. So this is because people lose their earnings completely during the period of lockdowns. And as you can see, the largest shock is observed for Ecuador, where the share of earners relative to the working age population drops from 54% to around 31%. Then by the end of 2020, we see that there's a recovery in the three countries. However, the levels of the percentage of earners relative to the working age population does not return to the pre-pandemic levels. So although the economy recovers, there is still a shock, still a drop in earnings by the end of 2020. And this is only considering full earnings losses, so people who go from having positive earnings to zero earnings. So this is what we call the extensive margin, but it's also likely that at the intensive margin, people who remain earners experience a decrease in the earnings they received. We also account for that in our nowcasting, but it's not shown, of course, not captured in this picture. So wrapping up what I said previously, what we do is to compare the situation before the pandemic and after or during the pandemic. Our pre-COVID scenario is based directly on the data of the last quarter of 2019 in all three countries, and our COVID scenarios are based on nowcasted data. And the way that we nowcast the data to produce our COVID scenarios follows the next steps. So first, with the data collected by statistical offices during 2020, with this data, we estimate the probability of having earnings. So for all people who are in working age, we estimate what's the probability of people having earnings during the pandemic. Then based on these estimated coefficients and the characteristics of people, we predict the probability of having earnings in the 2019 data based on the coefficients estimated for 2020. So basically what we're going to have is a ranking of people according to the probability that they might have lost their earnings in 2020. But remember, this is not panel data, so we are just applying the coefficients from one cross-section to the other. In our probability, once we predict the probability, we do not only include our deterministic coefficients estimated from the probit, but we also include a random term that allows us to account for the fact that not everyone with a higher deterministic probability might have only lost their earnings. There's also a random component accounting for the fact that other people might have lost their earnings as a result of the pandemic. So that's in terms of the extensive margin. This is what we use. And once we have this predicted probability, we adjust the number of earners by industry and formality status. So this is formal versus formal workers in the 2019 data compared to the 2020 data. So for example, if in the agriculture sector, we see that the number of earners has decreased from let's say 2 million workers to 1 million workers, then we will select the people in that industry with the highest probability of being earners, and we will keep only the first million in 2019 with the highest probability. We will set earnings to zero for all the other ones so that we match the number of earners in 2020. That in terms of the extensive margin, in terms of the intensive margin, for those people that remain earners in 2019 after the extensive margin adjustment, we adjust their earnings by the ratio between mean earnings in 2019 and 2020 by industry, formality status, and by employment status, meaning differentiating between employees and the self-employed. And here we could do we could disaggregate further to take into account the impact that the crisis might have had across other characteristics, for example, gender or educational level. But the more we try to disaggregate, the smaller our cells for ratios become. So that's why we have concentrated here only on the main characteristics that we consider important industries, because we know that lockdowns affected differently in different industries, formality status, and employees versus self-employed. So once we have created this nowcasted data, we use our microsimulation models to simulate both in the pre-COVID and in the COVID data, social insurance contributions, personal income tax, social assistance progress pre-pandemic, and the newly introduced emergency measures in each of these countries. And here, table 2 gives you an overview of the changes in tax and benefit policies during the pandemic. We see that in Colombia, for example, there was a COVID bonus for beneficiaries of already existing social assistance programs, that's Familias en Acción, Jóvenes en Acción en Colombia Mayor. There was a newly introduced benefit, social assistance benefit, Ingreso Solidario, and there were some other measures, devolution of VAT, which is actually a benefit. Impuesto Solidario is a tax that was levied on high earners, but then that it was abolished later on by the end of the year, but also reductions to social insurance contributions related to pensions and an adjustment of unemployment benefit. So we already see that Colombia, compared to Ecuador, had a larger number of measures that they implemented to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. If we move to Ecuador, actually there was only one main program that was introduced. This is the Bono de Protección Familiar, and this was only a 2 months payment of $60 per month. And that's another difference with Colombia. Actually, all the measures introduced in Colombia were preserved until the end of 2020, whereas duration was limited in Ecuador. And in Ecuador, there was also a small adjustment to unemployment benefit, allowing unemployed individuals to claim unemployment benefit within a shorter period of being unemployed. And then finally, in Peru, we also have a set of COVID-related measures that are introduced, mostly social assistance benefits, Bono Independiente, Bono Rural, Bono Yo Me Quedo en Casa, Bono Familiar Universal, but also an extension of personal income tax payment and an automatic reimbursement of payments in excess in 2019. Something important to point out about Peru is that all the social assistance benefits were considered as a lump sum tax, so it's only a one-off payment, but they were very generous compared to the payments that were given in Ecuador and Colombia. So this is what, so when we will look at the results, we will expect an important effect of the transfers in Peru during the pandemic, but this fades out at the end of 2020. More precisely, what we do in our analysis is to decompose the change in the income distribution into the contribution of different factors. And for this, we simulate 3 income distributions with our models. First, we take the pre-pandemic data, so 2019 data, and we simulate 2019 policies. Okay, so this is the baseline in 2019 data with 2019 policies. Then, to assess the change in the income distribution during the pandemic, then the second scenario, scenario C, is our 2020 data, so the pseudo data that we created, where we simulate 2020 policies. Okay, so this can be considered as the 2020 baseline scenario, 2020 data with 2020 policies. But in addition to this, we simulate a third income distribution where we simulate 2019 policies, but applied to 2020 data, okay? And what we want to capture with this scenario is the effect of existing benefits, so the pre-pandemic tax and benefit policies, given the shock in earnings that was experienced during the pandemic. So more precisely, these 3 income distributions allow us to decompose the change in the income distribution into the contribution of COVID emergency policies. That's if we compare scenario C with scenario B, sorry, because we are keeping the population fixed, we are applying, we are taking the 2020 population, but in one scenario we're applying 2019 policies and in the other one 2020 policies. Okay, so the difference between the two is going to capture the effect of the policies implemented in 2020. The second factor contributing to the change in the income distribution is automatic stabilizers. So these are pre-COVID policies that may have an effect in cushioning incomes given the shock in earnings. And we obtain this contribution by comparing scenarios B with scenario A. So in these two scenarios, we have kept fixed 2019 policies, but we have different data. In A, we have 2019 data, and in B, we have 2020 data. So what the difference between these two scenarios will capture is the effect of existing policies in mitigating the impact of the pandemic. For instance, one of the policies that can act as an automatic stabilizer from the benefit side is unemployment benefits. As people lose their employment, lose their earnings, some of them can claim unemployment benefit, and because they receive unemployment benefit, then the loss in disposable income will be lower than the loss in earnings because unemployment benefit will compensate part of the loss of earnings. From the tax side, personal income tax and social insurance contributions act as automatic stabilizers, because imagine that you are a high earner in 2019, you lose your earnings, so you fall from being inside the tax thresholds to being out of the tax thresholds. That means that in 2020, you will not pay taxes. So the fact that your taxes have decreased between 2019 and 2020 provides automatic stabilization once there's a loss of earnings, okay? So we would expect effects from automatic stabilizers from both benefits and taxes. And finally, the third contribution is just simply the change in earnings itself, and we obtain this by comparing scenario C with scenario A. So moving to the empirical results, I will concentrate first on changes in mean disposable income across the distribution. As I said, we will do this at 2 points in time. During the period where the economy was hit the hardest, as we observed in figure 1, this was the second quarter of 2020, and then we will assess the same effects of changes in mean disposable income, but now between 2019 and the end of 2020. And then I will move on to assess the effects in terms of changes in income poverty and inequality also in these two periods. So let's start with the changes in mean disposable income for Ecuador in the second quarter of 2020, okay? And I'll take Ecuador as an example, just to give you an idea of how to interpret the results that we show in this figure, and then I will move on to changes over time and to changes in other countries. So in this figure, what we observe is changes in mean disposable income across the income distribution for the whole population that is represented by the white circle in your graphs, okay? So for example, for the whole population, so that's the last bar in the graph, we see that mean disposable income has dropped in Ecuador by around 41% comparing end of 2019 to the second quarter of 2020, okay? So this is a substantial drop in mean disposable income for the whole population, around 41%, okay? But now, if we look across the income distribution, we see that the white circles have a U-shaped pattern. So there's a smaller decrease at the bottom and at the top of the distribution, and a larger decrease in the middle of the distribution. So what this means is that disposable income during the second quarter of 2020 fell much more in the middle of the income distribution in Ecuador compared to the lower part or the upper part of the distribution, okay? And we will continue to understand why we observe this change. But actually what we see is that the pattern, the U-shaped pattern that we observe in the white circles in disposable income follows the pattern that we observe in the black bars, that is the contribution of the drop in earnings to the change in disposable income. So basically, the pattern that we observe in disposable income is simply capturing the fact that earnings dropped more in the middle of the income distribution than at the bottom and at the top. But now if we concentrate on the black bar, so this is the contribution of earnings, what we can see is that in all cases, the black bars are below the white circle. This means that earnings dropped in a larger proportion than disposable income. And why should we expect this? Because of the contribution of the two other factors, okay? At the top of the distribution, this is the bright blue bars, we observe the contribution of automatic stabilizers, okay? So for example, if we focus on decile 10 in our graph, we see that earnings, the contribution of earnings to the fall in disposable income represents around a drop of around 35%, but automatic stabilizers have a cushioning effect. We see that the light blue bars are on the positive side of the graph, meaning that decreases in taxes, in tax payments, and social insurance contribution payments cushion the effect, the drop in earnings, and that's why the white circle falls in a smaller proportion than the black bars, okay? Disposable income falls in a smaller proportion than earnings. That's at the top of the distribution, and at the bottom of the distribution, we see that it's not this light blue bar that is playing a role, is this dark blue bar in our graph, and this dark blue bar in our graph is mainly capturing the effect of COVID-related policies. This is not surprising because these expanded social assistance programs were aimed at protecting vulnerable and poor households. And that's why we see a very large effect of COVID-related policies in decile 1, okay? So then again, if we look only at earnings in decile 1, so that's the black bar in the graph, earnings drop by around 35% relative to disposable income, but COVID-related policies account for around 13% of increase of disposable income, meaning that disposable income falls by around 22%, whereas earnings fell by around 35%, okay? So COVID emergency policies are mitigating at least partially the effect of the fall in earnings at the bottom of the distribution, okay? I will come back to this topic, but it is interesting to see that automatic stabilizers play a role only from the middle of the distribution to the top. So this means that it's mainly taxes and social insurance contributions, whereas benefits are not acting as automatic stabilizers. We do not see an effect of the light blue bar in decile 1, for instance. This means that there's no automatic stabilization of existing benefits in Ecuador, and we will see that this is a pattern in all countries, and we will discuss why. Now, that was the picture during the second quarter of 2020 when the Ecuadorian economy was hit the hardest. But what would be observed then by the end of 2020? We saw in our figure 1 that the economy recovers, the percentage of earners increase, but it does not return to the levels of the pre-pandemic. Here, figure 2 compares the situation of Ecuador in quarter 2 20, so that's the left graph, and the right graph presents the situation of Ecuador in the last quarter. So basically, the figure on your left is the same that we have here, okay, just in a smaller scale, and the figure on your right is the situation, the change in disposable income between 2019 and the end of 2020. What do we observe in Ecuador? That compared to the second quarter, disposable income drops in a smaller proportion. So we saw that disposable income in the second quarter fell by around 41%. Now we see that in the last quarter of 2020, disposable income falls by around 20%. So this is still a substantial drop in disposable income. So although the economy recovers, we still observe a drop in disposable income by the end of 2020, okay? So that is the first observation in terms of our time analysis. Then the second observation is that we still see a small effect. It's actually not very neat in the picture, but we observe an effect of automatic stabilizers at the top, okay? So you still have a small contribution of automatic stabilizers of the light blue bar at the top of the distribution. However, what we do not observe anymore at the end of 2020 is the role of COVID emergency policies, okay? So we see in the left graph, we had for decile 1 an important effect of COVID-related policies, and we see that now we have no effect by the end of 2020. This is because COVID-related policies in Ecuador were implemented only during the second quarter of 2020. They had a 2-month duration, meaning that by the end of 2020, although the economy still has not recovered, the government provided no protection to families anywhere across the income distribution. But now, if we move on to other countries, what do we observe? And here, I present the same graph as the one before, but for Peru. Again, we are comparing the situation, the change in disposable income between the end of 2020 and the second quarter of, between the end of 2019 and the second quarter of 2020. That's the picture in your left. And the figure in your right is the change between the end of 2019 and the end of 2020, okay? The first thing we note if we concentrate on the left-hand side picture is that on average for the whole population, that's the last bar in the left-hand side picture, disposable income falls also around 43% in Peru. So the drop in mean disposable income in Peru and Ecuador is very similar, okay? However, now if we look at the pattern across the income distribution, although we see also a U-shaped pattern in Peru, so in Peru is also the middle of the distribution that is hit the hardest by the pandemic in the second quarter, we see a very strong effect of COVID-related policies in the first decile. So during the second quarter of 2020, COVID-related policies do more than compensate for the loss of earnings for the poorest decile in the population, okay? So we observe that for decile 1, earnings fall by around 40%, but COVID-related policies represent around 80% of mean disposable income in that decile, meaning that in the second quarter of 2020, for the first income decile group, we observe an increase of around 40% mean disposable income, so at the end of the distribution. We also observe in Peru an effect of automatic stabilizers at the top of the distribution, in particular for decile 10, but then again, as it was the case in Ecuador, it's mainly at the top of the income distribution that we observe the effect of automatic stabilizers, whereas they play no effect at the bottom of the distribution, okay? Now, if we move on to the end of 2020 for Peru, we observe a similar picture as in Ecuador. The economy recovers. We still observe a drop in mean disposable income, now of around 20% for the whole population. And as it was the case in Ecuador, because COVID emergency policies in Peru were designed as a lump sum one-off payment, in the second quarter of 2020, there is no effect of COVID-related policies mitigating the drop in earnings by the end of 2020, simply because these policies were not preserved until the end of the year. Finally, we move to the situation in Colombia. And we see that the dimensions of, or the magnitude of the crisis is very different in Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. Already in the second quarter, shows the left-hand side picture, the drop in mean disposable income in Colombia is much smaller than in Peru and Ecuador. It represents around 25% decrease in mean disposable income for the whole population. So the Colombian economy was hit less hard by the pandemic than the other two countries. We still see, however, that across the income distribution, we observe a U-shaped pattern, meaning that the middle of the distribution was hit the hardest by the pandemic. We still see, as in the other countries, the effect of automatic stabilizers at the top of the distribution, mainly decile 10, and at the bottom of the distribution, as expected, we see the cushioning effect of COVID emergency policies. Okay, so that's the effect of, or that's the dark blue bars that you observe in the graph. But now, the situation in Colombia is also different than that of the other two countries if we compare the scenario of the end of 2020, so that's the right-hand side graph. First, we observe that disposable income, again, drops in a smaller proportion than in the middle of the year. The economy recovers much more than in the two other countries. We see a smaller drop in household disposable income, here of around 15%. But an interesting situation in Colombia is that we still observe by the end of 2020 the effect of COVID-related policies, okay? So we see that the dark blue bar is still there at the bottom of the distribution, and it now, for decile 1, more than compensates for the loss of earnings that we observe. And this is because out of the three countries, Colombia is the only country that preserved all newly implemented COVID-related policies until the end of the year. Okay, so COVID-related policies in Colombia then allow to mitigate the effect, the drop in earnings throughout the whole year. So now, let's move on to the effects on poverty and inequality. We observe a drop in earnings, but some compensating effects of tax and benefit policies. So we would like to see how this translates into changes in poverty and inequality. Here, figure 5 presents the Gini coefficient for our scenarios pre-pandemic and for the two scenarios during the pandemic for all three countries. And what we can see is that in all countries, the Gini coefficient increases dramatically during the second quarter of 2020. But then as the economy recovers, inequality decreases by the end of 2020, but it does not come back to the pre-pandemic levels. And we see this pattern across all countries, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. But perhaps more importantly here in the graph, this light blue bar that you observe in the different countries is capturing to which extent inequality would have increased if COVID-related policies were not implemented. And we see that in all countries, inequality will have increased more without the COVID emergency policies, in particular in Peru, during the second quarter of 2020, the Gini coefficient will have increased by around 0.04 points. So COVID emergency policies, although they do not fully compensate for earnings losses, they did have a cushioning effect in terms of reducing income inequality. And the case of Colombia, as you can see, is that then we observe this light blue bar both for the second quarter and the last quarter of 2020. This is because COVID-related policies were preserved for the whole year in Colombia compared to the other countries where they are present only in the second quarter. If we move now to poverty, so here we are presenting the change in the national poverty headcount during the COVID pandemic in the three countries. And we observe a similar pattern as that observed for inequality. In all three countries, poverty increases dramatically during the second quarter of 2020, when the economies were hit the hardest. Then poverty decreases by the end of 2020, but it does not return to the pre-pandemic levels. Actually, it remains quite high in all three countries. And then again, we observe in the light blue bars the mitigating effect of the COVID emergency policies that were introduced. These do play an important role. So in Colombia, they managed to decrease the impact of poverty by around 3 percentage points. In Peru as well, during the second quarter of 2020. In Ecuador, to a much lesser extent, only by less than 1 percentage point in the second quarter of 2020. And then, of course, for Ecuador and Peru, we observe no effect by the end of the year. So just to summarize our results, what we observe from our analysis is a dramatic increase in income poverty and inequality between December 2019 and the second quarter of 2020. Household disposable income drops less in Colombia. So Colombia is the country out of these three countries that suffers less from the pandemic. And COVID-related benefits have a more limited effect in Ecuador compared to Colombia and Peru. Compared to Peru, because the benefit amounts were much more generous during the second quarter of 2020, and compared to Colombia, because Colombia preserved the benefits until the end of the year. By the end of 2020, the economy recovers, but mean household disposable income remains lower than in the pre-pandemic case, around 20% lower in Ecuador and Peru, and around 12% lower in Colombia. And as I have mentioned before, only Colombia maintained COVID emergency policies in place until the end of 2020, then providing a cushioning effect over the period of the pandemic. Perhaps something that I will mention again here and that we could discuss further in detail is that when we observed the effect of automatic stabilizers, we saw that they played an effect only at the top of the income distribution. This means that, or this is because social assistance programs, or the main social assistance programs in these three countries, are designed as proxy mistested benefits. This means that they do not depend directly on household income. They depend on composite indices that capture housing characteristics, household characteristics, and that they are actually revised every 2 years or 3 years. So this means that as the economy suffers an income shock and people lose their earnings, the main social assistance benefits in these countries cannot play a role as automatic stabilizers. People do not become entitled to claim social assistance because they lose their earnings, because they depend on their housing situation. It's very hard that the index will change from one year to the other. So in terms of policy design, I think this opened a nice question for debate about whether or what is the role of social assistance benefits designed as proxy mistested in Latin America, and whether we could move to something in between, having benefits as automatic stabilizers plus preserving these proxy mistested benefits. Finally, just to give you an idea of our future research, we have been working with a number of countries, including the team of CHILMOD, to extend this analysis to cover a wider range or geographical coverage from Latin America. We want to extend the analysis to Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Mexico, and Uruguay. And this is interesting because, as we saw already in these three countries, the policies that were implemented during the pandemic were very different in design. So we would expect to see differences in the cushioning effects that tax and benefit policies have had across these countries. Now, more methodologically, what we want to do is to move away from nowcasting at least for the end period of 2020. So what we want to do is to compare directly survey data from 2019, the end of 2019, with survey data from the end of 2020. This is possible for the end of 2020 because by then statistical offices managed to adapt to the problems related to data collection. However, this is not possible for many countries and at the middle of 2020, because most surveys suffered quite significantly from collection due to lockdown periods, meaning that the surveys that we use for our nowcasting in 2020, the second quarter, cannot be directly used in our simulations to compare the effect from one data to the other. I will finish here, leaving room to questions, and I here just leave you some links on the work we have done, plus perhaps more interesting for people who are using microsimulation, the links where you can ask for access to the models that we have used in our research. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. Very interesting. Here we have a question from Dante Contreras. Should I read it, or Dante, would you like to say it you? Okay, I read it. He says it is quite surprising how quickly was the recovery in those countries. What happened in the labor markets? Was the recovery explained for an increase in informality? I would add a question myself to that. I was really, I would say that it is not complete, the recovery. It's still like 20% in 2 of the countries and 12% in Colombia, I thought I saw. And my question was that still in the informal sector? Was it the gender? Did you do like a gender gap analysis in that recovery? At least in Chile, it's not very unequal, that recovery still. Thank you again.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you, Dante. Yes, I'll start with Claudia's comment. So yes, we observe a recovery, especially I think figure 1, so the graph that you saw in the percentage of earners as relative to the working age population, might capture only partially the recovery that we have in mind. So this picture only captures the change in earnings that are positive to 0. So as we move away from lockdown, people return to their jobs, so they continue and they become earners again. However, as the economy has suffered, at the intensive margin, it's very likely that mean earnings have decreased. Okay, and this is mainly what is being captured in our changes in mean disposable income across the income distribution. So we still observe a drop, as Claudia mentioned, of around 20% in Ecuador and Peru, and 12% in Colombia. So the economy recovers, but the recovery is heterogeneous. Unfortunately, to reply to Claudia's second question, we did not look at gender at the gender perspective. I think this is extremely interesting and important, and we could do that as part of our next steps in collaborating with more institutions. We didn't do it mainly because we were interested in the overall shock, but I think it's as relevant to look at the effect across population groups. However, we did look at the effect in terms of formal versus informal employment, and I did not show it here, but it is hard to assess to which extent a recovery might be due to the fact that people who lost their jobs in the formal sector might move to the informal sector, because we do not have panel data, so we just have aggregates comparing the number of people in each sector in the different cross sections. But let me just share the screen again to show you what we did, and that starts going in that direction. So here in this figure, we show only, remember the dark bars, the black bars in our main graph. This was capturing the drop in earnings across the income distribution. And what we did in this graph was to disaggregate those black bars into the contribution of earnings in the formal sector, informal sector, for employees or for the self-employed. So the blue bar here, for example, represents the change in earnings, the drop in earnings for formal employees. The light gray bar represents the drop in earnings for informal employees. The black bar represents the drop in earnings for self-employed formal workers, and the drop in, and the dark gray bar in the graph represents the drop in earnings from informal self-employed workers. Okay. And first, we see some interesting patterns. So if we look at Q2, so at the second quarter, we see that the drop in earnings for formal employees happens mostly at the top of the distribution. Okay, and this is something we would expect. Formal employees are usually in the upper part of the distribution. That's what we observe the shock here. But it plays a quite important role. So if we look at Peru, this blue bar for the whole population contributes significantly to the drop in earnings. The second change in earnings that contribute a lot is the drop in informal self-employed earnings. Okay, so that's the dark gray bar that we observe here, and that is actually most concentrated at the bottom of the distribution because these are informal workers and informal self-employed workers. Okay, the contribution of formal self-employed is very small. That's the that's the black bar here. Okay, and then again, because this is formal self-employed people, we see the effect mostly at the top of the distribution. As we move to the end of the year, okay, all earnings recover differently, but it seems that although informal earners or the drop in informal earnings decreases, still earnings from informal self-employed workers contribute a lot to the change that we observed between 2019 and 2020. Okay, the drop in formal employment earnings, so that's the blue bar here, still contributes more to the change, the overall change in earnings. So these are the two main factors contributing to the changes. Formal employment, so changes at informal earnings, and changes in informal self-employment earnings. As I said, so although I think this graph comes a bit close to the question that Dante was asking, because we see the effect of different groups of earners, it's hard to assess because we don't have panel data, for instance, whether some of these people that dropped this, that lost their formal earnings here, moved actually to informal self-employment, okay? But at least this gives some idea of the changes in terms of what have been the main contributors in terms of a group of workers.
Thank you, Javier, for your answer. Is there any other question or comment? No? Okay. Well, thank you, Javier, for your paper. It was very interesting, and it raises a lot of thoughts about these automatic stabilizers in Latin America and probably in Chile as well. So thank you very much for that. Well, we have our third seminar in a few minutes. we will make a break now. We will have a 5-minute break again, and we'll come back with Karina Doorley about actually gender gaps in tax benefits. So see you in 5 minutes.
I am. Now, can you see my slides, sir?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, great. Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation, Claudia. It's great to be at the launch of another new microsimulation model based on the EuroMod platform. So today I'm going to speak to you about tax benefit systems and their interaction with the gender gap in income. So just by way of introduction, the gender income gap is by and large a product of the gender wage gap and the gender work gap. So when we talk about the gender wage gap, there are usually two components to this. So the explained gender wage gap is a part of the difference in male and female hourly wages that we can attribute to observable differences in their characteristics, things like differences in education levels or experience levels. But there's also the unexplained component of the gender wage gap, which some of the literature suggests might be due to different preferences between men and women. So women tend to maybe trade off wages for things that we don't observe in the data, like, let's say, a shorter commuting time or more flexible working environment. But it could also be due to discrimination. So it's likely to be a mix of things, this unexplained part of the gender wage gap. And when we think about the gender work gap, then we can think about the extensive margin and the intensive margin. So at the extensive margin, men are more likely than women to be in the labor force, so to be participating, but they're also more likely to work longer hours if they are participating. So the result of the gender wage gap, explained and unexplained, and the gender work gap at the intensive and extensive margin is a gender income gap that has been reducing over the last number of decades, but which is still quite sizable across countries. So just to give you an example, over the last few decades, the wages of men and women have been converging in the EU, but there's still a significant gap remaining. So in the EU, that gap was estimated at about 15% in 2019. It's a little lower in Chile at 9% in 2020. And gender differences in labour force participation are probably even larger. So in the EU, the male labour force participation rate was 87% versus 75% for women. And you'll see the corresponding statistics for Chile there. So 79% for men versus 59% for women. But then even given participation, average hours of work are higher for men than they are for women on average. So 40 per week in the EU for men versus 34 for women. And so it doesn't look like this gender gap in income is going to close by itself anytime soon. It's sort of a structural feature of our society, given traditional gender divisions of work and caring roles. And it's important to quantify it and to understand it because it has implications for poverty, for income inequality, and for bargaining power, both during the working life, but also into retirement, because pension receipt is dependent on contribution history and wages in some cases. So there's quite a well-developed literature on how to tackle the different sources of the gender income gap. So in terms of reducing the gender gap in work, we can think about increasing female labour supply. And a number of policies have been shown to be quite successful at doing this. So things like the individual taxation of spouses, which reduces the marginal effective tax rate on the secondary earner, who's usually the woman, can quite substantially increase female labour supply. Also, parental leave for both parents can play a role, both by changing sort of gender norms about work and caring, and also for providing sort of a good childcare solution when children are very young that doesn't involve only the mother staying home. Childcare subsidies as well, which provide affordable and good quality childcare from a young age, have also been shown to be quite effective at closing the gender work gap. In terms of reducing the gender wage gap, there are also a whole suite of policies that can be used to tackle this directly. So equal pay legislation is in place in most developed countries now, but collective bargaining and minimum wages can also be used to quite effectively reduce the gender wage gap at source. There's also an increasing awareness of the importance of gender budgeting. So gender budgeting is kind of the analysis either ex post or ex ante of proposed or actual changes to budgetary policy. And it's looking at their effect by gender. So over half of OECD countries are currently engaged in gender budgeting, in that they do this whenever they're coming up with their annual budgets. They will check the gender impact in as far as they can. And a lot more OECD countries are promising to begin doing this in the near future. So, and the reason this is important is because although tax benefit systems don't actually differentiate by gender, apart from policies like maternity leave, there are gender implications of tax benefit policy. And that's because if men are more likely to work, they're also more likely to pay tax. And if women are more likely to be in caring roles, they're more likely to benefit, for example, from welfare benefits that are targeted at carers. So separately again to this, so we have, policies that can tackle gender income gaps at source. We have gender budgeting that can try to sort of target new policies at specific areas. But we can also monitor the sources of the gender income gap and how those are interacting with the tax benefit system. And that's the topic of today's talk, that I'm going to spend the rest of the talk discussing this and showing you how this can be done and some results from a selection of countries. So the idea here is that given that there is a gender gap in labour income, tax benefit policy, apart from targeting the sources of this gender income gap, it can also simply redistribute between men and women so that the gender gap in disposable income is less than the gender gap in market income. And because tax benefit systems tend to be progressive, most tax benefit systems are doing this anyway. So there's a small literature that examines the extent of this in European countries. So the first paper I've listed here, Fagari and co-authors, look at a selection of European countries and look at how tax benefit systems affect redistribution within couples. And they find that the income inequality within couples is reduced by the tax benefit system, but there's variation in the level of within country or within couple equalization by country. So it really depends on the type of tax benefit system, on the various instruments. A more recent paper then by Avram and Popova find that benefits do most of the work in counteracting gender inequality compared to taxes. So in their study of 8 countries, they found that benefits were doing most of the heavy lifting. So what I'm going to talk to you for about the next 15 minutes is a paper that I have co-written with Claire Keane on the components of the gender income gap in Europe. So what we do in this paper is develop a method to show how the gender income gap is cushioned by the tax benefit system. So we identify the relative contributions of the gender wage and the gender work gap to the overall gap. So we kind of show what the total gap in market income between men and women is made up of for a start. We then show how this gap is cushioned and how much of that cushioning is performed by taxes and how much by benefits. And then we show which of the sources of the gender income gap are cushioned the most. So is it the unexplained gender wage gap that's cushioned, or is it the work gaps? And we apply this method to tax benefit systems in the EU and the UK. So a key assumption here when we're engaging in any sort of gender analysis using income is how income is shared between members of a couple. So the unitary model, which is typically used in analyses of income inequality and is really behind any sort of Gini index or at risk of poverty rate that you're looking at or interpreting, assumes that income is fully pooled. So every member of a household enjoys the same standard of living. Now, the non-unitary model, which implies that there's some sort of bargaining going on within the family, depending on who is receiving what income, also has some validity. And there's quite a well-developed literature on, the kind of the value of looking at this as an option as well. So what we do in this work is assume no income sharing between members of a couple. So we assume that whoever receives the market income or pays the tax or is eligible for the particular benefit, they keep it for themselves. So there's no sharing of those types of income or tax liability between members of a couple. The instruments that are shared between members of a couple are things that aren't easily allocated to either the man or the woman. So things like child benefit or housing benefit, which are allocated on the family level. So this is obviously a massive simplification because most couples share most of their income between them. But we think it's sort of the important margin to look at in this work because it's an upper bound. It's an upper bound of the extent of the potential gender income gap. And it captures differences not only in income, but in bargaining power and consumption and so on. Because we know that who receives the income does influence how it is spent. So we've produced results for an income sharing assumption as well, but those are available in the paper. But we really think this is the kind of important set of results to look at. If we assume that members of a couple don't share their income between them, so we sort of set aside inter-household reallocation, what is the tax benefit system then doing with intra-household reallocation? So I'll discuss the decomposition method very, very briefly. So we define market income as a product of wages and hours plus non-labor income Y. So wages represented by W here are a function, so these are estimated and predicted in our model. They're estimated as a function of sort of the usual set of demographic characteristics. And then we have a price structure that differs for men and women. So we do the estimation separately for men and women. And this will allow us to create a counterfactual for women if they were paid in the same way as men are, just by swapping the price structure over. So then market income is transformed into disposable income by a tax benefit function D here. And D, we're obviously going to approximate using microsimulation, and I'll talk about the different models that we use in a little while. And then we have the gender gap in market income. It's quite simply the average difference between male market income and female market income. And the gender gap in disposable income is similar. So it's the difference between average male disposable income and average female disposable income. And then we can arrive at a cushioning effect of the tax benefit system, which is simply the difference between these two gaps. So it's the gap in market income minus the gap in disposable income. And this cushioning index has parallels with the wider inequality literature. So for people who are familiar with the Reynolds-Smolensky index, that measures the effect of the tax benefit system on income inequality as measured by the Gini index. So this index is quite similar in that it measures the effect of the tax benefit system on gender earnings inequality as measured by average differences in income between men and women. So by introducing a benefit and a tax function, then we can identify the effect of benefits and taxes separately. So we can split this cushioning effect out into the effect of benefits and the effect of taxes to see which is really doing the heavy lifting here. And then we can also estimate the part of the cushioning effect that is due to the cushioning of the gender wage gap and the gender work gap. So to do that, we have to define some counterfactual market income and disposable income distributions. So the first set is if both men and women were paid according to the price structure of men. So this really allocates the male price structure to female characteristics and comes up with counterfactual wages for women, which is then translated into employment income and used in our microsimulation model. And importantly here, we assume no behavioral responses to closing the unexplained gender wage gap. So we're assuming that women aren't going to increase their labour force participation in response to higher wages. So we also define counterfactual market and disposable income distributions for women based on the male work hours distribution. So this is kind of a three-step process. So first we randomly draw an hours choice for women from a similar man. So based on age, education, marital status, and number of children. We convert this hours choice into employment income for women who are already working. So this increases the hours of work of working women so that their work hour structure is similar to the male work hour structure. We then adjust the participation rate of women who we observe to not be working, but who draw a positive hours choice. So this adjusts the participation structure of women to be similar to the male participation structure. And then without going into all of this, we can then separate the cushioning effect of the tax benefit system into its effect on the unexplained gender wage gap, on the intensive work gap, on the extensive work gap, and then on the interaction between all of these three things, okay? And then we finally have our residual, this other gap here. So in this other gap, we're going to have things like different probabilities of men and women being self-employed, which we don't simulate a counterfactual for. different self-employed income for men and women, which we also don't simulate counterfactual for, and also the explained wage gap. So we don't adjust female characteristics to be similar to the male characteristics structure in order to close the explained wage gap. So that will also be here in this other gap. So we use 3 microsimulation models for this work. So Switch is for Ireland, UK Mod for the UK, and Euromod for the rest of Europe. And these, importantly, are harmonized models, which all use the Euromod platform, which allows for cross-country comparison. And the policy and data year is 2017. And for Ireland and the UK, because we use Switch and Euromod, we have information on current income. So Euromod typically has information on income for the last reference period for last year. But for Ireland and the UK, we have current income, and that allows us to estimate the gender wage gap. So we can perform this wage work decomposition only for Ireland and the UK because we don't have a good hourly wage variable for the other countries. Okay, so this graph shows the gender income gap in Europe. On the y-axis, we have the gender gap in monthly income in percentage terms, so as a percent of male income. And on the horizontal axis, I've grouped countries by typology, roughly speaking, just to facilitate the interpretation. So if you look at the black dots first, and these show the gender gap in monthly income in each typology as an average. So the Anglo-Saxon liberal countries, so that's the UK and Ireland, they have the largest gender gap in market income. The social democratic, so this is the Nordic countries, they have the lowest gap in gender income, together, roughly speaking, with the former USSR countries. And I guess what's interesting about this is there's quite a lot of variation in the gender gap in market income. But then if you look at the gray triangles, so this shows the gender gap in disposable income. So after market income has been through the tax benefit system, what does the gender gap in income look like? And the gap between the gray triangles and the black dots is very variable. And it's not necessarily the case that countries with higher market income gaps have higher cushioning. So for example, in the UK and Ireland, the Anglo-Saxon countries, there's quite a lot of cushioning going on. So the gender gap in disposable income is quite a bit lower than the gender gap in market income. But the same is true in the Nordic countries, which have a very low starting point. The gender gap in market income there is relatively low, but then so is the gender gap in disposable income. So there's quite a lot of cushioning going on in, for example, those two typologies, even though their starting points are very, very different. And then if you look at the southern countries, so this is Cyprus, Greece, Italy, Malta, Portugal, and Spain, there's very little cushioning of the gender income gap going on at all. So there are really very stark cross-country differences here. The bars underneath show you the relative contributions of taxes and benefits to the cushioning effect. And again, there are quite some differences here. So the Nordic countries and the Anglo-Saxon countries, the tax system plays quite an important role. That's the light gray bar. Whereas in the former USSR and the post-communist countries, they tend to have much flatter tax schedules, so much less progressive tax schedules. And the tax system plays a very small role, and it's really the benefit system that's doing most of the work here. So I said we could do the gender wage and work decomposition for 2 countries only. So I've shown this here. So the black dots again show the gender gap in market income for Ireland and the UK separately. And if we go from the bottom up, these bars show the composition of this gap. So starting at the bottom, the gender gap in market income due to the unexplained gender wage gap is relatively low as a proportion of the overall gap in market income. So it's about 7 percentage points in the UK and about 3 percentage points in Ireland. And moving up, the green portion of the bar shows the gender gap in market income that is due to differences in participation between men and women. That's quite a bit bigger in Ireland and maybe not so big in the UK. Moving up, the light grey part of the bar shows the portion of the gender gap in market income that's due to different hours of work. And this is quite a chunky portion of the overall gender gap in market income. And then the next kind of bright blue section of the bar shows the interaction between these 3 these three effects. So the interaction between the unexplained gender wage gap, the participation gap, and the hours gap. So overall, we can explain most of the gender gap in market income through the unexplained gender wage gap and the gender work gap. What's left over here, this kind of light blue portion of the bar, is the it's the residual, which is down to differences in self-employment income and differences in observable characteristics between men and women. So really overall, the takeaway here is that the gender income gap is mostly due to work gaps in Ireland and the UK. So the unexplained gender wage gap plays a relatively small role here. And then if we look at how the tax benefit system cushions these gaps separately, the ones that stand out here are, so light blue or the bright blue at the bottom, this is the interaction effect. So there's some cushioning of this interaction between wages and work. There's quite a bit of cushioning of the other gaps. So these are the self-employment gaps and the demographics. And there's very little cushioning of the gender wage gap. So this is barely visible here, the kind of stripy part of the bar. And then there's quite a bit of cushioning of the hours gap and very little of the participation gap. So really, I suppose the cushioning that is happening is in terms of hours of work and not so much participation and not so much the gender wage gap. So just moving on and sort of thinking about how these gender income gaps are likely to be affected by the pandemic, I'm going to show you some work that I have done co-authored with Denise Sullivan and Cathal O'Donoghue, which relates to Ireland. So I suppose the thought experiment is this: how might the pandemic affect the gender gap in income? And if we think about, without even consulting the literature, what would we expect to happen? We know that women are disproportionately in low-paying and insecure jobs. We know they're also engaging in child and elder care disproportionately. So those kind of two facts would kind of make you think that this is going to be worse for women than it is for men. But they're also disproportionately working in both lockdown sectors, so that's things like hospitality, and essential sectors like healthcare. And that's at least true in Ireland and many EU countries, although it may not be true everywhere. And so while we know that tax benefit systems don't discriminate between men and women, these traditional divisions of work and caring mean that they're not going to be gender neutral. And that applies to both the automatic stabilizers that kicked in during the pandemic and to any new policies that were introduced. So most of the research to date suggests that this was a she session, so that women suffered more job and income loss due to the pandemic. And this is actually in contrast to the Great Recession, the financial crisis, where it was very much a man session. But there are cross-country differences. So in South Korea, Japan, and the UK, women were found to have lost their jobs less than men. And in a study of 28 countries, Ireland was one of the few countries which saw a slight increase in women's labour supply relative to men's. So that's work by Alon and co-authors. So what we do in this work is estimate the gender income gap in Ireland prior to and during the three waves of the pandemic. And we isolate the components of the gender income gap, and sort of as I showed you in the last paper, but we're going to group them together a little bit more. So we're going to show labour supply, wages, and occupational structure separate from the rest, because occupational structure actually turns out to be quite important. And then we estimate the cushioning effect of the tax benefit system on the gender income gap before and during the pandemic. So just to give you an idea of how the pandemic played out in Ireland, unemployment rates were reasonably similar for men and women, except sort of during particular spikes coinciding with particular waves of the virus. So I've shown here the three waves of the virus that we're looking at. So May 2020, we have a spike in unemployment, slightly higher for men than for women. November 20, there was another wave of the virus, but the lockdown in this case was a lot less severe than the previous one. So childcare facilities stayed open, as did construction. And you'll kind of see that reflected here. So the unemployment rate of men wasn't as high as the unemployment rate of women during the second lockdown. And that's really because the construction sector stayed open. And then the last wave of the virus was in January 2021. And here the lockdown, again, was a bit more severe than the second one, but not quite as severe as the first one. So construction was closed, as evidenced by the slightly higher male unemployment rate, and essential childcare was open, but no other childcare. Just looking at youth unemployment rates during the same period, this was really quite stark. So peaking at over 70% at the height of the crisis, and really at every point during the pandemic, the youth unemployment rate for women was higher than that for men, although it does seem to be leveling out now as we're sort of emerging from it. Just very briefly then, the policy response to the pandemic in Ireland. So there was a new unemployment benefit introduced, which was more generous than existing unemployment benefits, and it wasn't contribution based or means tested. So it was quite a generous flat rate payment to anyone who lost their job as a result of the pandemic. There was also a wage subsidy scheme introduced to encourage employers to hold on to their employees, and the rate of payment was similar to the pandemic unemployment payment, and the employer could still pay top-ups. And lastly, there was an enhanced illness benefit. So anyone who was isolating or sick with the virus was eligible for this enhanced illness benefit, which was paid at the same rate as the pandemic unemployment payment. So relatively high by comparison to other welfare payments in Ireland. So obviously we don't have up-to-date survey data for this whole time period. So like Xavier did, we're using a nowcasting technique here based on microsimulation to calibrate the income distribution to December 2019 for a start. So that's our pre-pandemic period. And then we calibrate to 3 points of the pandemic. That's May 2020, November 2020, and January 2021. And we estimate the gender income gap at each point during the pandemic and its evolution, and sort of following loosely the methodology I outlined in the last paper. We estimate the relative contributions of the market and the tax benefit system to its evolution. So here I'm showing the employment rate, the weekly employee hours, and the employee hourly wage for men and women separately at each point during the pandemic. So going from pre-COVID to wave one, the male unemployment rate dropped by 34%, and you can compare that to the female employment rate dropping by 30%. So men lost slightly more unemployment, or slightly more employment in wave one of the virus, and that pattern continued to a lesser extent in the subsequent waves. Weekly employee hours followed the same pattern. So men lost 35% of their hours in the first wave compared to 28% for women. And then losses were sort of similar enough in waves 2 and 3 for men and women. The employee hourly wage for men decreased by 5% during the first wave of the pandemic, but by 14% for women. And then losses were a little bit more similar in waves 2 and 3 for both men and women. So then if we look at the gender gap in market income, pre-COVID, the gender gap in market income, we estimate at about 40%, and actually didn't change that much over the course of the pandemic. So 41% in wave 1, back down to 40% in wave 2, and up to 41 again in wave 3. So that's reasonably stable, we'd say. But if you look at the gender gap in disposable income, that did change. So it went from 35% at pre-COVID to 29% in wave 1, 30% in wave 2, and 31% in wave 3. So before the pandemic, the tax benefit system in Ireland was cushioning about 1/8 of the gender gap in income, whereas during the pandemic, it was cushioning about 1/4 of the gender gap in income. And we found that very interesting because in many countries, this has been sort of termed a she-session, but here we find that actually women were doing slightly better in terms of disposable income relative to men during the pandemic. So just kind of 2 points to draw your attention to here. You see for in the pre-COVID period, women were receiving quite a bit more in benefits than men were, but during the crisis, those levels had sort of equalized. So the benefit levels of men and women were much more similar than they were prior to the pandemic. And that's really because of the flat rate nature of this new pandemic unemployment payment, which wasn't means tested. And one more thing then, the tax and social security. So while men paid a lot more in tax prior to the pandemic, they still paid a lot more in tax during the pandemic than women. And this is really what we're going to see stabilized gender income inequality during this period. Okay, so this graph shows the components of the gender gap in market income and how they evolved over the crisis. So the black dot shows the gender gap in annual income in euro. And we've got the pre-COVID level is about 17,000, and you can see that it drops quite significantly during wave 1 and then increases again slightly in waves 2 or 3. But we've seen from the last slide that actually in relative terms, these were quite similar. So compared to the underlying average male income, these were all at about 40%. What's interesting here is the composition of that gap. So the green bar shows how much of this is due to the gender work and wage gap. So whereas before I had broken it down by intensive and extensive margin, unexplained gender wage gap and interaction, these are all in one here. Then we have occupational segregation, which is kind of the stripy bar on top here. And then other is the dots at the very top on the pre-COVID bar. And what happens is this occupational segregation bar shifts. So while prior to the pandemic, the difference in occupational structure between men and women was contributing to the gender income gap. During the pandemic, it was actually working in women's favor. So if they had the occupational structure of men, they would have done worse during the pandemic. They would have lost more income. So really the disproportionate representation of women in essential sectors seems to have outweighed their presence in lockdown sectors during the pandemic. And that's why this occupational structure bar shifts. And then lastly, this graph shows you the cushioning effect of the tax benefit system on the gender income gap and its decomposition into the effect of benefits and taxes separately. So the black dot shows the gender gap in market income, the grey dot is the gender gap in disposable income, and then the bars below show the effect of benefits and tax separately. So tax was doing most of the work prior to the pandemic, but benefits were also playing a role. But what happened during the pandemic is that benefits are no longer really playing that much of a role. And that's because, as we saw in the descriptive statistics, men are now benefiting from benefits at about the same rate as women because of the extent of their job loss and the fact that the new payment is not means tested and not contribution based and is a flat rate payment. So benefits are doing less of the cushioning during the pandemic, but the automatic stabilization of taxes is still working to reduce the gender income gap. And in fact, it's actually reducing it by more than it was prior to the pandemic. So let me finish up. Just kind of a few observations to leave with you. So I've shown you that tax benefit systems cushion gender income gaps, but that there's some variation across countries. And it's really an empirical question to what extent tax benefit systems are capable of cushioning the gender income gap. That requires information on the composition of the gender income gap and how the tax benefit system is structured. And I showed you that the cushioning effect is not necessarily larger in countries with higher gaps in market income either. So in the Nordic and the Anglo-Saxon countries, it's the tax system doing most of the cushioning work, whereas in the former USSR and the communist countries, the benefit system does more. And we saw that it's the gender work or the other gap that is cushioned rather than the unexplained gender wage gap in the UK and Ireland at least, which were the two countries we could use for this analysis. And I suppose that's kind of reassuring in a way because it leaves the onus on firms to close the gender wage gap themselves rather than creating some sort of perverse incentive to continue paying women less than men. And during the pandemic, the gender gap in market income was pretty stable in relative terms, but men lost more employment and women saw larger wage losses. So those two effects sort of counteracted each other so that the gender gap in market income was quite stable. And the main source of the gender income gap throughout the pandemic remained wage and work gaps. And we have occupational segregation working in favor of women during the pandemic compared to against them prior to the pandemic. And the tax benefit system actually cushioned the gender income gap by more during the pandemic than prior to the pandemic. And so this is kind of the result of two opposing forces, I suppose. The cushioning effect of benefits decreased because of the flat rate and non-means tested pandemic unemployment payment, but automatic stabilization by taxes contributed much more. And I suppose this sort of underlies the importance of well-designed automatic stabilizers, but also of monitoring inequality along multiple dimensions. So we often sort of look at how automatic stabilizers are coping during periods of shock with income changes and income inequality changes. But actually during the pandemic, they were, at least in Ireland, they were playing an important role in reducing gender income inequality as well. And that's likely to have been the case in other countries too. So let me just leave you with a sort of open question. So how much redistribution should the tax benefit system do between men and women? And I don't have an answer to this. So I suppose on the one hand, redistribution is good from the point of view of income and gender equality, and there's no sort of denying that. But we do have a classic problem here of adequacy of safety nets, of trying to provide an adequate safety net for people while still maintaining financial incentives to work. So while the tax benefit system is, doing some work in most countries at redistributing between men and women, I've sort of been silent in all of this research so far on what the optimal level of this is. And I don't know that there's maybe an answer. It's probably something we'll leave to future research, but it's quite possible that the more redistribution the tax benefit system does between men and women, the lower the incentives are for secondary earners, so for women to work. And that's also a policy objective of most governments. So balancing these two things is quite important. So we've sort of taken these gender income gaps as given so far, without sort of considering that there is an obvious feedback between the tax benefit system and the gender income gap, because it does influence labour supply and wages as well. So again, we're just going to kick that can down the road and leave it to future research. But I thought it was worth mentioning because it's an interesting and open question at the moment. So I'm finished.
Thank you, Karina, for the presentation. Very interesting indeed. I will see whether there is question from the public first, and then if not, I will. Javier, yes? You go first.
Hi, Karina. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I think it's really interesting. And I guess Claudia might have been thinking about how this might apply to Latin America. At least I was thinking about it. My question was, of course, it is crucial, as you mentioned at the beginning, how you split the different sources of income between men and women, right? And of course, you need to make a decision about this. I'm more concerned not about what decision you take for the baseline. I'm more concerned about how well this applies in terms of the pandemic. So, for example, this 35% gap that you see, when you have such a high shock that affects, households, not only earners, would you expect that the same behavior in terms of income splitting would continue within the household? For example, the husband loses completely their earnings, the wife is receiving benefits. Is she not going to split because now the husband is unemployed? So I'm wondering to which extent this assumption holds within this type of economic shocks. That would be my first question. My second question was more related about your last point, which I think is extremely relevant. Would we want a tax and benefit system that completely redistributes and equalizes incomes across men and women, but that might affect women's incentives to enter the labor market? But I was wondering also to which extent childcare costs play a huge role. Are women allowed, or partners, not necessarily women, are partners allowed to go both full-time when there's really high childcare costs in the countries? And that's the case, I think, at least for the UK. I'm less familiar with Ireland. Thank you.
Okay, two excellent questions. Thanks, Xavier. So I hadn't actually thought of how the income splitting assumption would apply during the pandemic, but I think, so let me answer it this way. The principle is sort of the same, right? So what we're interested in is potential gender income inequality, right? And that applies both in the baseline and in the pandemic scenarios. it's absolutely true that households may radically change their behavior on income splitting, even through intergenerational transfers and things like that. So I totally take the point on that. But what I think we're trying to do in this is show the effect of the tax benefit system cleanly from anything else that might be going on, any behavioral changes. And actually, what I didn't show you, but we have shown in the paper, is that most of the gender income gap is among married couples. So if you split the sample into married and single people, the gender gap in income for single people is very, very small. And that's true across the 27 EU countries and the UK. The gender gap between members of married couples is very high, right? So if you assume full income splitting between them, you're just losing a huge part of the story there, right? And I totally agree. And there's some empirical evidence on this that, most couples share about 80% of their income between them. So, there's probably a case to be made for doing some sort of analysis that isn't one or the other. It's not full income splitting. It's not no income splitting, that maybe attempts to assign some of these things in percentage terms to members of a couple. But I think it's sort of not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to show, apart from the redistribution that occurs within the household, right? We're trying to take a look at the government's role here. So the effect of the tax benefit system and what it has. So I suppose what you have left over, the gender gap between married couples, that is the amount of redistribution they have to do among themselves if they want to have the same standard of living. So I think that's kind of what we're trying to estimate there. But I hadn't thought about how behaviour would change during the pandemic. So thank you for that. In terms of incentives to work, I completely agree. Childcare costs in the UK and Ireland are among the highest in the OECD. So they're both way up there. So financial incentives to work for secondary earners are very, very low in those two countries. So what we're not doing in this work is showing the effect of non-cash benefits like childcare subsidies, right? So that could be sort of another stage of this. And I guess you might want to do some sort of allocation, whether that childcare subsidy should be assumed to go to the secondary earner rather than the primary earner, or split between them. So we'd have to sort of think about that. But yeah, what we're looking at here is direct taxes and benefits, rather than any non-cash benefits like childcare subsidies. So that's not in the analysis, but would be a very interesting addition. And I completely agree that childcare is the massive issue. It's the elephant in the room for many one-earner couples, and addressing that is probably the single best way of addressing the gender income gap.
Thank you, Karina. I have two questions also. One is about this drop in the gender gap, in the income gender gap. Did you do a composition effect where I thought maybe the low earners women went out of the labor force and that's why the gender gap decreases or something like that? Or where the women in these health sectors could have been paid better during the pandemic, I don't know. And the second question is about the mechanism of this effect of the tax system on gender gap. And I was wondering whether the type of taxes, the income taxes are paid could be affecting. I know some countries taxes are paid by the individual and in other countries by the household, or they have this kind of reduction. I don't know if you have like seen that.
Yeah, so if I start with the question on the composition, so we know, so I assume you're referring to the pandemic stuff. So during the pandemic, I think this was quite similar across countries. It was young people that were most affected, that were most likely to lose their job. We saw that it wasn't, the unemployment rates of men and women were reasonably similar, although the unemployment rates of young women were higher than those of young men, right? So I guess if you extrapolate from that, then the unemployment rates of older women should have been slightly lower than that of older men. So there is definitely a composition effect going on there. So the composition of the labour market shifted, and there would have been sectors like health and retail where wages were actually increasing slightly compared to other sectors where wages were dropping, like retail and hospitality and things like that. So there's definitely a compositional effect. And actually, I think most of the wage difference that we're seeing over the course of the pandemic, so we saw that men had a very small wage drop at the beginning compared to women who had quite a large wage drop. Most of that is compositional. So it is the types of men and women who were leaving the labour force, because it wasn't just that there was an increase in unemployment rates, but there was also sort of an exodus of women with children from the labour market temporarily to care for children and elderly relatives. So that will have played a part there. On the taxation system, so in the analysis for the EU and the UK, wherever there was a joint taxation system, so there are countries with joint taxation, we've assigned the tax in proportion to market income. So we've sort of split that between couples because it can be a bit complicated otherwise, and who's actually paying the tax. So we have done some sort of splitting on income tax for joint taxation countries. Does that answer your question on that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Are there any more questions? Well, we are on time, I think, to finish. Thank you again for your presentation. Very, very interesting. And I'm happy to see more of your work later. We are starting this network of researchers in Chile with this model, and we will keep in touch with you all. Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Javier, for being here. And we will maybe see you later online, probably. In the name of the team, I am really grateful for your time and for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and good luck with the network.
Thank you. Thank you, Javier.